October 14, 1962. The world didn't know it yet, but a single photograph, taken 70,000 feet above Cuba, had just pushed humanity to the edge of annihilation. No soldiers moved, no shots were fired. But in that moment, the countdown to World War III had already begun. The U-2 spy plane glided silently through the Caribbean sky, its cameras clicking like a heartbeat in the clouds. Major Richard Heiser, calm but alert, focused on the vast island below, the farmlands, the quiet villages, the endless green stretching toward the horizon. Then, something caught his eye. Long, narrow shapes, perfectly aligned, covered by netting. It wasn't a field. It was a launch site. Heiser didn't linger. He stayed on course, clicked the last frames, and turned back toward Florida. Those photographs would soon travel from a secret darkroom to CIA analysts in Langley, and finally, to the President of the United States. What they revealed would shake the world. The images showed missile launchers, fuel trucks, Soviet soldiers, and the unmistakable shadow of medium-range nuclear missiles. Range, 1,200 miles. Targets, Washington, D.C., New York, and nearly half of the United States. In 5 minutes, they could obliterate entire cities. Through the night, CIA analysts worked in silence, cross-referencing every detail: the shadows, the spacing, the construction timeline. And by dawn, one conclusion was certain. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear weapons in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of America. When President John F. Kennedy was handed the file, he said nothing at first. He studied the photos, the launch pads, the sheer precision of the operation. And then, under his breath, he whispered, "Jesus Christ." That same morning, he assembled a secret council, a dozen of the most powerful men in Washington. Their mission: decide the fate of the world. Some argued for an airstrike, a swift attack to wipe out the missiles before they became operational. Others warned that one wrong move could trigger a Soviet counterattack, not just in Cuba, but in Berlin, or even against the American mainland. For 24 hours, the government said nothing. No announcements, no leaks. Not even the vice president knew what was happening. While ordinary citizens went about their day, the president and his advisors wrestled with an impossible choice: act and risk total war, or wait and risk losing everything. And as one general told Kennedy that night, "Mr. President, if we get this wrong, it will be the last mistake humanity ever makes." The next morning, another U-2 aircraft took off from Florida, its pilot ordered to fly deeper into Cuban airspace. But what he discovered on that mission would prove that the Soviets weren't bluffing. They were preparing to launch. October 16, 1962, 6:30 a.m. The President of the United States was about to start the most important day of his life. John F. Kennedy had been awake since dawn, pacing his office in silence. Outside, the White House lawn glistened with early morning dew, calm, peaceful, unaware that the world's most powerful man was staring at photographs that could end civilization. CIA Director John McCone laid the evidence on the table. Black and white prints, missile launchers, concrete pads under construction. Each photo sharper, clearer, and more terrifying than the last. McCone's voice was steady, but the room was frozen in disbelief. "Mr. President, we estimate 6 to 8 launch sites. The missiles are operational. The range covers almost every major city on the East Coast." Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, leaned forward. "How long before they're ready to fire?" "Less than 2 weeks, McCone said. "Maybe sooner." Silence. Only the ticking of the clock filled the room. Then Kennedy spoke, calm but firm. "How did this happen? Khrushchev promised me no offensive weapons in Cuba." Nobody answered, because the truth was simple. The Soviets had lied. The meeting that followed would become one of the most intense moments in modern history. A dozen men, military generals, intelligence chiefs, and political advisors, gathered inside a locked room known as the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Their job was to find a way out, without starting World War III. The first option: airstrike. Hit the sites before they're armed. Fast, decisive, clean. General Curtis LeMay, head of the Air Force, slammed his fist on the table. "Mr. President, we can destroy every missile in one strike. If we don't act now, we'll look weak. And weakness invites war." But Defense Secretary Robert McNamara disagreed. An airstrike could kill Soviet soldiers. Khrushchev would have to respond. Then they hit Berlin, or Turkey, or us. The debate raged for hours. Strike or wait. Attack or negotiate. Every option ended with the same risk: nuclear war. Finally, Kennedy raised his hand. "We need more time, more proof, and a plan that doesn't end in mutual destruction." He turned to McCone. "I want confirmation. Every photograph, every site. Send another U-2 flight over Cuba. I want eyes on the ground." The president's calm voice masked the storm beneath it. He knew what was at stake, not just his presidency, but the survival of the human race. As the men filed out of the room, Robert Kennedy stayed behind. "Jack," he said quietly, "what if they launch before we act?" JFK looked at his brother, the weight of the world in his eyes. "Then we pray," he said softly, "and we make sure history knows we tried everything before lighting the fuse." Outside, the sun had risen over Washington. Birds sang, cars moved, the world kept spinning. But inside the White House, the clock was ticking, and every second brought the planet closer to the brink. Moscow, the Kremlin, midnight. While America debated its response, the man behind the world's most dangerous gamble sat in silence, staring out over the snow-covered city. Nikita Khrushchev, first Secretary of the Soviet Union, had made his move months ago. Now he was waiting to see if the West would call his bluff. The room was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow of a desk lamp. Around him sat the Politburo, a dozen of the most powerful men in the Soviet Empire. Each of them nervous, each of them pretending not to be. On the table lay a map of the Caribbean. A thin red circle was drawn around a small island: Cuba. Khrushchev broke the silence. "The Americans surrounded us with missiles," he said. "Turkey, Italy, Britain, all aimed at Moscow. Now, for the first time, the bear bares its teeth, and they panic." Marshal Rodion Malinowski, Minister of Defense, nodded. "The missiles are in place, Comrade First Secretary. Our technicians report full readiness within 10 days. And the Americans? They know." Malinowski replied. "Their planes saw everything." Khrushchev smiled, not with joy, but with defiance. "Good, let them see. Fear is a weapon, Marshal, sometimes stronger than any bomb." But across the table, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Chairman, the Americans will not tolerate nuclear weapons 90 miles from their shores. Kennedy may be young, but he is not weak." Khrushchev turned his sharp gaze toward him. "And what would you have me do, Andrei? Bow to the West. Apologize for defending socialism. They point their guns at our homes, and we are the aggressors." The minister fell silent. Khrushchev stood, pacing slowly. His boots echoed against the cold marble floor. He wasn't just thinking about Cuba. He was thinking about Berlin, about the wall his soldiers had built 1 year earlier, and the message it sent: that the Soviet Union would not be humiliated again. "This is balance," he said finally. "They think they hold the world by the throat. But now, they will feel our breath on their neck." An aide entered quietly, handing him a cable from Havana. "Khrushchev, read it," lips tightening. Comrade Castro requests additional air defenses. He fears invasion. Then we send them, Khrushchev said. Every missile, every gun, every man he asks for. We will not abandon our allies. The Americans will have to live with what they started. The room remained quiet for a moment. The only sound was the wind howling outside the Kremlin walls. Then, in a voice low and deliberate, Khrushchev spoke words that would echo through history. If they strike Cuba, we strike Berlin. If they invade, we answer with fire. The men nodded, but no one met his eyes. Because deep down, they knew. Once that order was given, there would be no turning back. Khrushchev poured himself a glass of vodka, lifted it to his lips, and whispered, "Your move, Mr. Kennedy." Outside, snow continued to fall on Moscow, soft, quiet, almost peaceful. But that night, beneath the stillness, the world's two greatest powers had begun a deadly game of chicken, and neither side could afford to blink. Washington, D.C., October 22, 1962. The world held its breath. President John F. Kennedy sat behind his desk in the Oval Office, a single sheet of paper before him, the draft of a speech that could either calm the storm or ignite it. He looked up at his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, standing by the window. "You think this will hold them?" the president asked. Robert hesitated. "It has to, Jack, because the alternative is nuclear war." Kennedy leaned back, the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. For days, he'd listened to his generals demanding a strike on Cuba. Air raids, invasion plans, nuclear readiness. They wanted action. He wanted survival. He looked again at the words on the page. Words that would soon be broadcast to millions. "We will not tolerate offensive nuclear weapons in the Western Hemisphere." The decision was made. The United States would not invade. Not yet. Instead, Kennedy would draw a line in the ocean. A naval blockade. A quarantine, as his advisors called it, to avoid the word war. But everyone knew what it meant. Any Soviet ship carrying missiles to Cuba would be stopped, searched, or turned back. The stakes couldn't be higher. One wrong move, and the world would end in flames. Night fell. Television sets flickered in homes across America. Families gathered in silence. Then Kennedy's calm voice filled the airwaves. "This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated." Across the Atlantic, in Moscow, Khrushchev's aides rushed into his office, breathless. "Comrade Premier, Kennedy has spoken. He has declared a naval blockade." Khrushchev slammed his fist against the table. "Blockade? That is an act of war. Does he think we are children?" He turned to his staff. "Send this message to Washington. You are playing with fire, Mr. President. If you interfere with our ships, you will bear responsibility for the consequences." The message was sent, but the ships kept sailing. By dawn, Soviet vessels were approaching the quarantine line. American destroyers took positions. Aircraft carriers launched patrol planes. Submarines waited silently beneath the waves. In the Situation Room, Kennedy watched the radar screen. Tiny blips moved closer. Each one could mean disaster. "Any sign of them turning?" he asked. "Not yet, sir," replied the naval commander. "But they're slowing down." Minutes passed like hours. Then, a report came in. The Soviet cargo ships had stopped. They were holding position just outside the line. A collective breath filled the room. No one cheered, no one smiled. Because the crisis wasn't over, only paused. Kennedy turned to his advisors. "We bought time," he said quietly. "Now we use it." Outside, the world exhaled, for the first time in a week. But in both Moscow and Washington, leaders knew this fragile calm could shatter with a single command. And somewhere, deep beneath the Atlantic, nuclear submarines waited, engines humming, torpedoes armed. The next move would decide humanity's fate. October 24th, 1962, the day the world nearly burned. At dawn, the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet spread across the Caribbean, a wall of steel stretching thousands of miles. On the decks, sailors stood silent, staring into the mist. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Soviet ships were coming. Each vessel carried more than cargo. They carried consequences. The order from the White House was clear. No ship passes through the quarantine line. On the aircraft carrier U.S. Essex, radar screens glowed with movement. Lieutenant Commander Harper adjusted his headset. "Contact, sir. Multiple Soviet cargo vessels. 200 miles out and closing fast." He paused, swallowing hard. One of them is escorted by a submarine. The room went quiet. At that moment, President Kennedy sat in the Situation Room, his eyes fixed on the map. Tiny red dots marked the Soviet ships. Blue ones marked the American line. The dots were moving closer and closer. "Any word from Moscow?" Kennedy asked. Robert Kennedy shook his head. "Nothing yet. Just silence." The silence was worse than threats. It meant the Soviets hadn't decided whether to stop or strike. Out at sea, the tension thickened. American destroyers broadcast warning signals across open channels. "You are entering a restricted zone. Turn back immediately." No reply. Only static. Every sailor knew that one wrong move, one nervous finger on a trigger, could unleash World War II. In the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev paced his office, chain-smoking. His advisors urged him to hold the line. "Do not yield, Comrade Premier. The Americans must see our strength." But Khrushchev knew strength came with a price. And that price could be everything. Hours passed. Then, at 10:25 a.m., the U.S. destroyer USS Gearing detected a Soviet tanker, the Bucharest, approaching full speed. "Captain," a crewman called, "they're not slowing down." "Hold fire," the captain ordered. "Signal again." The signal blared across the water. Still no response. Tension snapped like a live wire. Fighter jets roared overhead, circling the ship like vultures. On the bridge, sailors gripped their weapons, waiting for a command that could end their lives. Then, the Soviet tanker began to turn. Slowly, reluctantly. Cheers broke out on the deck. But no one celebrated for long. More ships were still coming. In Washington, Kennedy received the update. "The Bucharest has turned away, sir." He exhaled, but his voice stayed steady. "Good. Let's pray the others do the same." By nightfall, several Soviet vessels had stopped or reversed course. But not all. One, a freighter named Alexandrovsk, continued forward, its cargo unknown. Behind it, deep beneath the waves, Soviet submarine B-59 was lurking, armed with a nuclear torpedo. The Americans didn't know it yet, but that single submarine was about to bring humanity within seconds of annihilation. Inside B-59, temperatures soared. The crew hadn't surfaced in days. Oxygen was low. Communication with Moscow was lost. They could hear explosions above. Practice depth charges dropped by U.S. ships. To the Soviet captain, it sounded like war had begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared. One launch, and the U.S. fleet would vanish in fire. But one man stood in his way, the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov. He refused to authorize the launch. He argued, shouted, begged. "There is no confirmation of war. If you fire, you will start it." After agonizing minutes, the captain relented. The torpedo was disarmed. The sub surfaced, battered, gasping for air. That single act saved the world. Back in Washington, Kennedy would never know how close the U.S. had come to nuclear destruction that day. The standoff at sea was over, but the crisis was not. Because even as the ships turned away, Cuba was still armed, and the missiles still ready to launch. October 26, 1962, the world stood on a knife's edge. American warships circled Cuba. Soviet missiles were still armed and ready. And in both Washington and Moscow, the phones had gone silent. For 13 days, two men held the fate of humanity in their hands. President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Both faced impossible pressure. Both were haunted by the same question. Would the next sunrise even come? Inside the White House, tension had turned into exhaustion. Kennedy's advisors were divided. The generals wanted to invade Cuba, strike fast, destroy the missiles before they launched. But others, like Robert Kennedy, warned that any attack could mean nuclear retaliation. The room was filled with arguments, voices clashing. Kennedy listened, but said little. He knew one mistake, one misread signal, could end civilization itself. That evening, something unexpected arrived. A message from Moscow. It wasn't an official telegram. It came through a back channel, in plain text, desperate, emotional. Khrushchev's words were almost pleading. If there is no intention to doom the world to catastrophe, let us not simply pull at the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. He proposed a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised never to invade the island. It was a fragile offer. But before Washington could respond, a second message arrived. This one, harsher, official, cold, full of demands. The new letter insisted the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Missiles aimed at the Soviet Union's heart. Now, there were two offers, one emotional, one aggressive. Which one was real? Inside the Oval Office, Kennedy sat with his brother Robert late into the night. The clock ticked past midnight. The air felt heavy. Finally, JFK said quietly, "We can't lose control now. If we respond to the second letter, it's over. We'll answer the first and ignore the second." But they knew they needed a hidden move, something to make it work. That's where the Backchannel began. Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in Washington. The meeting was tense, both men aware the world could end within hours. Robert spoke first. "If your missiles leave Cuba, ours will leave Turkey." Quietly. No announcement. But it will be done. Dobrynin nodded slowly. Both men understood what this meant. A silent exchange that could save millions. Back in Moscow, Khrushchev read the message in disbelief. The Americans were offering him a way out. He could protect his pride, avoid humiliation, and still claim victory to his people. The next morning, radio operators in Washington picked up a new broadcast from Moscow. Khrushchev's voice came through, calm, steady, decisive. The Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union. In the White House, a long, trembling silence filled the room. Then, slowly, applause. Some cried. Others simply sat back, speechless. The crisis, the most dangerous confrontation in human history, was over. But it wasn't triumph Kennedy felt. It was relief and exhaustion. He knew how close they had come. A single torpedo, a single order, a single misread signal, and the world would have ended in fire. In Moscow, Khrushchev also knew. Both men had stared into the abyss and stepped back. The Backchannel deal remained secret for years, but history would remember it as the quiet moment when diplomacy saved humanity. The missiles were gone. The ships turned back. And for the first time in 13 days, the world exhaled. But peace came at a cost, one that would haunt the men who made it possible. President John F. Kennedy had faced down nuclear war, and won without a single shot fired. To the world, he was a hero. But inside the White House, he felt something different. Guilt. For how close it came. For how easily it could happen again. He'd seen the limits of military power and the madness of brinkmanship, and he swore never to come that close again. In the weeks after the crisis, secret cables began flying between Washington and Moscow. Not threats, not warnings, but something new: understanding. Out of the ashes of fear came a strange kind of respect. Kennedy and Khrushchev, two men who had nearly destroyed each other, now began writing directly. Personal letters, private words. No translators, no posturing. Just two leaders trying to keep the peace. Those letters would lead to one of the most important inventions in modern history, the hotline. A direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin. A red phone. Though in truth, it was never actually red, symbolizing instant contact between the two superpowers. No more delays. No more misread signals. If another crisis came, they could speak in minutes, not days. It was a quiet revolution, built not from power, but from fear of losing everything. Meanwhile, on the streets of Havana, the world looked very different. Fidel Castro felt betrayed. He had expected to be the hero of the revolution, the man who stood up to America. But to Khrushchev, Cuba was only a chessboard, a pawn in a global game. Castro never forgave the Soviets for pulling their missiles out. And from that day, he began charting his own defiant course, one that would keep Cuba isolated for decades. In Moscow, Khrushchev's victory was short-lived. The crisis had shaken his standing inside the Soviet government. His own generals saw the withdrawal as weakness. And 2 years later, he was quietly removed from power. In Washington, Kennedy faced his own reckoning. The public never learned the full story. The secret trade of missiles in Turkey stayed hidden until long after his death. To most, he was the man who stood firm. But history would reveal a different truth. He didn't win by force. He won by compromise, and that was his greatest act of courage. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. It forced the world to look in the mirror, to see what nuclear war really meant. Not glory, not power, but extinction. Over the next decade, that fear shaped policy, treaties, and entire generations of soldiers and spies. It led to arms control talks, nuclear test bans, and eventually, the concept of mutually assured destruction. The grim understanding that if one side launched, both would die. Kennedy wouldn't live to see how much his actions changed the world. 1 year later, in Dallas, he was gone. But the legacy of those 13 days, the restraint, the reason, the humanity, outlived him. As for Khrushchev, he lived out his final years quietly, away from power. Watching the Cold War, he tried to contain spiral into a new era of proxy conflicts and espionage. But the two men, across oceans and ideologies, had achieved something extraordinary. For a brief, fleeting moment, they had stopped the clock. They had shown that even in an age of madness, reason could prevail. Because peace, real peace, isn't the absence of fear, it's the courage to act despite it. For 40 years, the world believed it understood what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We thought it was simple. Two men, two superpowers, standing on the edge, then stepping back from destruction. But when secret files were finally declassified, we learned the truth was far more terrifying. We didn't just almost start World War II. We missed it by a whisper. In 2002, historians and retired officers gathered in Havana for a closed-door conference. Among them sat Russian General Anatoly Gribkov, a man who had served directly under Khrushchev during the crisis. When he spoke, even the American delegation went silent, because what he revealed changed everything we thought we knew. Soviet nuclear warheads weren't on their way to Cuba. They were already there. fully operational, armed. By the time Kennedy addressed the world on live television, Soviet commanders in Cuba already had the authority to fire tactical nuclear missiles if attacked. Washington had no idea. If the U.S. had invaded, as most of Kennedy's generals demanded, American soldiers would walk straight into a nuclear battlefield. Florida, Georgia, and the entire Caribbean would have burned. But the most chilling revelation came from under the sea, from the Soviet submarine B-59. On October 27, 1962, what historians now call Black Saturday, that submarine was cornered near Cuba by U.S. Navy destroyers. Depth charges exploded around it as warning shots. Inside, the temperature reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew was exhausted, terrified, and out of communication with Moscow. They believed war had already begun, and the captain decided to launch a nuclear torpedo. One shot, capable of igniting global nuclear war. But one man stopped it. Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine's second-in-command, refused to authorize the launch. He argued, he shouted. He risked his career and his life. And in doing so, he saved the world. Historians call him the man who prevented World War II, a name that never appeared in the headlines until decades later. And there was more. Documents revealed that a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance jet accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace that same night. Fighter jets scrambled to intercept it. Meanwhile, American missiles in Turkey were already on high alert. One false signal, one nervous finger on a button, and the world would have vanished in fire. The crisis ended without war, but it left behind a scar, deep and invisible. For both sides, it was a near-death experience for humanity itself. And in the years that followed, Kennedy and Khrushchev worked quietly, almost secretly, to make sure it never happened again. They built the first direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, a red phone that connected the two leaders instantly, bypassing politics and bureaucracy. It was a thin wire of communication, but that wire kept the peace for decades. When the final reports were declassified, one thing became painfully clear. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a confrontation between nations. It was a moment when human error, fear, and pride almost erased civilization. And yet, in that chaos, a few rational voices on both sides chose restraint over revenge. They proved that peace, however fragile, is sometimes held together not by governments or armies, but by the courage of individuals who refuse to push the final button. Because in October 1962, the world didn't just survive a political crisis, it survived itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just history, it was a warning that power without understanding can destroy everything. For 13 days, humanity stood at the edge of extinction, and for once, stepped back. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more untold Cold War secrets, the betrayals, the hidden files, and the people who changed history without firing a single shot. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are the ones we never see.